We want inner peace, and that what is satisfying our desire is real. And what Plato says is it's possible to get those so they're mutually affording each other, that inner peace and that seeing more deeply in the world. And he calls that anagage. That's the ascent out of the cave. That's optimal agency, optimal connection to the world, optimal meaning, optimal inner peace.
Thank you for joining me again, Mr. John Vervaeke. It is wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Mohan. It's great to be here again. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, we were discussing a little bit before, but yeah, around the topic of attention and agency and aligned AI. So talking a little bit about us and then probably about the machines and artificial intelligence. And so I kind of, to start off with, you published a paper last year or 2022 on integrating predictive processing and relevance realization. And that seems to hinge on precision weighting of prediction error, which is the predictive processing account of attention.
Yes.
I wonder, could you say a little bit about that and about, what, because people think about attention, they think of all sorts of just, folk psychology concepts. So I wonder, could you nail that down, why that's so important?
Right. I would like to say that the talk I gave at the Leiden Symposium on predictive processing that I've also uploaded as a video, and Mark Miller was also there. I think I improved. I think I sort of clarified the relationship between predictive processing and relevance realization, how they're integrated. So perhaps we can touch on that at some point. And it was some important people have taken a look at that, Julian Kuverstein and others, and think it's on the right track. So let's start. Let's start in the at common sense folk psychological level. What is attention? Well, attention is like sort of a spotlight. You shine on things, and when you shine your attention on them, they stand out, and it sort of keeps your attention. And there's something true about the spotlight metaphor. Attention does make things more salient, and that is kind of like them being shiny as light hits them, and there's truth in that. And to use a distinction I make use of a lot, it's good language for training attention. It's really good language for training attention, but it's very, very poor language for explaining attention. There's lots of ways in which attention doesn't work that way. And the person who really, I think, opened this up and got us away from all the old psychological models that just presuppose the spotlight metaphor. I mean, there were earlier ones of filter, but they aren't good for tracking, and they don't really account for some of the integration processes in attention. So the old filter models are insufficient. The filter models get the idea that something determining relevance is going on, but they're inadequate in a lot of ways. So then the spotlight metaphor sort of becomes more dominant, and then psychological models, until quite recently, were sort of bound to those in certain ways. But Moll, in his book on attention as cognitive unison, he did what every good philosopher does. He blew things wide open. And he said, look, we use verbs and attention, noun-based words like attention, which comes from attending, right? We use verbs in two ways. We can use them to pick out direct actions like walking. I can tell you walk, and you say, okay, and you walk. I'll say sit, and you'll sit, okay. But if I say practice, you go, what? Practice what? And I say, I need you to train. And you'll say, well, train what? See, there's some things that designate not an action, but this is more adverbial, how we're modifying other actions we're already performing. Right? So this is an adverbial idea, right? And so what he points out is, well, attention's actually like that. Notice how very different attention is. I can ask you to pay attention, and that means you go from just sort of seeing to looking, or you go from just hearing to listening, or you coordinate your looking and your listening, or you coordinate your looking and you're remembering, or you coordinate your looking, your listening, and you see you're doing multiple different things. And what you are doing in each one of these is you're modifying other things you're doing. So if I say to you, I want you to pay attention, but I don't want you to do that by changing your perception, interior or exterior, or changing how you're thinking about something, or changing how you're remembering. I want you to just pay attention. I don't know. And so what he said is, attention is cognitive unison. What we're doing is what we're doing with processes is we're getting the sub-processes within the process to find some goal equally relevant, or we're getting a bunch of processes to share a goal as equally relevant. So we're sort of enhancing, making more coordinated relevance realization. Now, he doesn't use quite that term, but I have no problem putting that language on his model. And so what that means is we have to ask, well, how is relevance realization and attention tightly related? And then we know that a lot of the empirical work and some of the later theories like Treisman's integration theory of attention and others, right, and the selective attention, we're starting to emphasize these two roles that had sort of been dimly pointed at with the filter and the spotlight metaphor of relevance realization. One thing the attention is doing is getting us to ignore a whole bunch of information, and that's like the filter. The other thing it's getting us to do is integrate, to coordinate, do that cognitive unison that Moll is talking about, integrating all the processes together. And that's what we're doing in selective attention. And in selective attention, we're not just zeroing in, we're binding things together. We're making them stick together and stick to us. And then once you move to that notion of, oh, attention is doing this relevance realization, you see it playing a fundamental role in all of cognition, because as I've argued, and I'm not going to repeat all the arguments, at the core of a lot of our cognitive processes is this ability for relevance realization. And then what happened, and this is where I have to thank Brett Anderson, is Brett said, what's happening in predictive processing is sort of zeroing in on this problem of this selection, this exclusion, and this binding within the predictive processing stack, and they're calling that precision weighting. And I think we need to integrate the two theories together. And then we published a paper in 2022 doing that and arguing that it could help explain the schizotypical psychosis autism spectrum. And then more recently, I've taken that integration that was proposed in the 2022 paper, and at a conference last year in Leiden in the Netherlands, I argued that we could understand how the two theories sort of get rid of the homunculus in each other if we pair them together. And that gives us a
something I was going to bring up, because that's the difference. It was really, there's a paper by Fernandez and Johnson, Mark Johnson, that did the metaphors we live by, and a lot of that work with Lakoff, and he describes the two types of attentional theories as cause theories and effect theories. And those earlier ones that you mentioned, like the spotlight, the filter model, as cause theories. And the problem with those, that attention is actually causing something, is that you end up with the infinite regress. You end up with this kind of homunculus of what's in there causing it. Well, there's another person in there and they're causing it. Whereas the latter ones, like predictive processing and relevance realizations, that attention is an effect of other cognitive processes, like the cognitive unison. And so, but again, this is like the agency is sneaking in a little bit there, because the problem with a lot of, I've been giving out about Robert Sapolsky a lot in the podcast. I actually had Rick Rapetti on last week.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Complain about the determinism. And one of his arguments is he uses William James as an example of a lady saying to him, that the world's on the back of a turtle. And William James says, well, what's the turtle on? And she says, well, it's turtles all the way down. So there's this, emphasis that, okay, it's just homunculus on homunculus on homunculus, so there is no locus of control. But from my reading of the literature at the moment, that the intentional control, like precision weighting, is something that we have influence on, but there's no homunculus there. So I'm kind of wondering then, with relevance realization, like, how do you account for the control? Like, we don't just end up with like a predictive homunculus or a precision homunculus.
Okay, so there's two.
How does that work?
Excellent. So there's two things. One is, let's call it, this first stage is just removing the homunculi. And then the second stage, right, is the co-emergence of attention and agency, rather than trying to get an Aristotelian substance ontology going, where there must be a subject to which predicates attached. We want to, and this is sort of more of a Buddhist approach, we want to see attention and agency emerging together. So I'm going to try and do those in that order, if that's okay with you. But please interrupt me, because I'll just keep going, right? Interrupt and I'll pause. So the problem with the homunculus and precision weighting is, so what is precision weighting? may I? Can I assume that your audience is familiar with predictive processing, or do I need to review some of the basic ideas behind it?
Yeah, they're probably somewhat familiar with it, to be honest. But yeah, if you want to even introduce it, I suppose it could help to frame
Right.
the problem.
Okay. So well, this actually helps. Let's think about general intelligence, which we have. We can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains in a wide variety of ways. And how we do in any one domain is massively predictive on how we do in all the others. And of course, the current LLMs don't demonstrate this, and blah 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 blah. Right. And uh, and what that general intelligence, I argue, points to are meta problems. These are two problems you have to solve whenever you're trying to solve any specific problem. Um, and these are therefore constitutive of you being an adaptive problem solver. One is anticipation, that you can predictively prepare for the world. In fact, we judge and attribute intelligence when we see how far into the future and across as many contexts an animal can anticipate the consequences of its own behavior, right? And that's good reason, because that intuition is tracking the deep correlation between anticipation and general intelligence. Now, the thing about that is there's another meta problem, which is relevance realization, which is the core of my work, which is at any moment, you need to gather information to solve a problem you're confronting. And the problem is the amount of information you could pay attention to in the environment is astronomically vast. The amount of information in your long-term memory is astronomically vast. All the possible combinations within, all the possible combinations of information without, astronomically vast. All the possible combinations between the within and without, astronomically vast. All the possibilities you could consider, astronomically vast. All the consequences of action. So here's what you don't do. You can't check them all to see if they're going to be relevant to your problem or not. That's, of course, the classic version of the frame problem. But you can't just arbitrarily string them together, because you'll fail an astronomically large number of times to solve your problem. So this is what you have to do. You somehow have to ignore most of that information and zero in on the relevant information. That's the problem of relevance realization. And I've argued, and I'm not going to repeat all those arguments here, that at the core of categorization, at the core of reconstructive memory, at the core of communication, at the core of problem solving, at the core of insight, etc., you find this problem of relevance realization. And all the various disciplines have sort of slammed in. At the core of attention, you find the problem of relevance realization. What should I pay attention to within and without? How should I coordinate attention within and without? You can see it all. Okay. Now, the thing I want you to understand is that these two problems, this was part of the insight, this problem of anticipation, and that's what predictive processing is. Predictive processing is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not just predicting the environment, the organism is predicting and preparing. So I tend to use the word anticipation because that means predictive preparation, right? In fact, if you put organisms in situations where they can predict but not prepare, they get extremely psychologically disturbed. But notice something. The more I anticipate into the future, the more that problem of relevance realization expands. And the more I try to limit the relevance realization, the more I shrink how much I can anticipate the future. And so these two problems need to be solved in an interlocking fashion. Is that enough of a prelim about the two theories and why they belong together at an abstract level?
Absolutely, yeah. And even just to bring that, I suppose, to the precision weighting, which comes down to where RR is. I mean, how that functions within the predictive system maybe would be good to kind of
Let's do that.
spell out for people.
So, I mean, there's a lot of math here, and I don't like to talk too much about the math because I'm not a mathematician. And secondly, I have philosophical, theoretical concerns. Everybody admits at one level, the brain can't be doing straight Bayesian calculation because it's computationally intractable. So the brain is actually doing some approximation. And then that approximation is itself represented with very complex calculus equations. And we get into the whole rule described, rule following. I can describe the solar system with calculus. It doesn't mean it's doing calculus. And so I tend to just put that aside. And what I think is I point to like a profound theoretical insight within predictive processing to try and introduce it to people. So again, we're trying to get at this anticipatory thing. Now, what you might think you do is directly try to sort of anticipate the world, predict it, and predict yourself and coordinate them so you can prepare. The problem about predicting the world is the feedback from the world is often delayed, distorted, deceptive, missing, and you can't tell what's signal and noise because there's so much information flooding it. And so the brilliant insight, and it's like one of these things, as soon as somebody says it, you go, oh, right, of course, is you don't try and predict the world directly. The brain tries to predict itself as it's interacting with the world, which is like, it's, oh. So you have sensory motor systems, and they will just automatically causally interact with the world, and there'll be patterns in that. And then what you do is you have a level above that. I'm speaking abstractly here, not necessarily anatomically, right? You have a level above that in the brain that's trying to predict that level of activity in the brain that is capturing the sensory motor patterns. And it tries to predict them and complete them ahead of time. That's how you can prepare. It tries to predict them and complete them ahead of time. Now, here's the thing, that part of the brain, the sensory motor, is inside the brain, and it can give very clear feedback to the level above it. Almost like backprop. It can give very clear feedback to the level above it if it made an error or not in its prediction. And then you get this, they basically, talk to each other and continually correct each other. So the bottom layer gets better and better at anticipating the world. And what happens is, by modeling itself in this way, it models the world. And in modeling the world, it is always modeling itself. And I want you to remember that, because you can hear agency starting to be sewn into the very beginning of predictive processing. In modeling the world, it's modeling itself, and it models the world by modeling itself. And then now, an extra part of agency, you make this recursive. You stack these layers on top of each other, and you get predictive processing. And then what you have is error signals are flowing up from the lower levels to the bottom levels, and these anticipatory attempts to detect and complete patterns are flowing down. Now, the problem you have is, but what signals should you let go high up? And how much should you modify the signals coming down? And that's where the homunculus can sneak in. And what was happening initially is they were trying, really simple stuff like, well, the reliability of the signal, that's useless. I'm getting a very reliable signal right now from this patch of my table. I'm not paying attention to it, right? Wow, the type. Oh, the type. And then you have to smuggle in categorization, blah, 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 blah. And then Andy Clark sort of, he sort of bit the bullet and said, what we're talking about is task relevance. And it's like, oh no. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, this is useless. This is just a relevance realization homunculus, right? But then what Brett said is, no, we can put the two together. Now, here's the idea. And I'm going to use an analogy between Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection, and our current theory of evolution integrates the two together. So genetics gives you this reproductive system. So I want you to think of what predictive processing is doing, is it's reproducing the sensory motor loop. That's what it's doing. It's reproducing the sensory motor loop. And what is it trying to do? It's trying to reduce being surprised by the world. That's what it's doing. That's what anticipation is, trying to reduce being surprised by the world. As it does that, it gets into these binds. What's one bind? Here's an important one. This is not the only one. When I'm trying to make a prediction, I have a sample of data, and I'm trying to predict the world. This is the central problem in statistics, because patterns in my data sample don't necessarily correspond to patterns, right? So here's a survey. How many people here have heard of John Vervaeke's work? And you put up your hand and I put up my hand. Oh, look, everybody's heard of John Vervaeke. That's ridiculous. That's sampling bias, right? So what you want to do is you got to be careful about how you generalize from your sample to your data. But you hit this trade-off. What's the trade-off? Well, I can be biased. What does that mean is I'm missing patterns in my sample that actually generalize to my data, generalize to the world. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll make my system more sensitive to pick up more patterns. But as I do that, I make it more and more prone to what's called variance. What I'm doing is picking up on patterns in my sample that don't transfer to the world. Now, this is a bias-variance trade-off. As I make my system more sensitive to avoid missing patterns, I make it more and more liable to mistake patterns in my sample for patterns in the world. Well, I want to reduce my sensitivity, so I don't do that. Well, as I reduce my sensitivity, I start to miss important patterns in my data. So I'm always trading between missing patterns and mistaking patterns. And there's no final way to solve that, because what you're doing is constantly trading. And that trade-off, and this is important, is completely dependent on the environment you're in, because the environment determines which kind of error is more costly to you, misses or mistakes. And so this is the proposal. So predictive processing, reproducing your sensory motor loop, it's hitting these inevitable trade-offs, and that's just one. And then what it does is it self-organizes. Opponent processing, it self-organizes because it's doing this up-down thing. And opponent processing is you create two processes that are linked together and are constantly trading between each other. And what that does is it allows you to get what's called an optimal grip. So this is from Merleau-Ponty. What should I pay attention to? Well, the details, maybe. The whole thing, maybe. This, but you notice I can't do all of them at the same time. I'm constantly, and what do? I try and find the one that's best for this environment, for the task. I find this trade-off sort of sweet spot between them all. That's the point of relevance realization. That's when my cognition best fits the situation. That's like natural selection. And so look how your attention is doing it. You have two systems in your attention. You have a task focus that is really trying to ignore everything but what John Vervaeke is saying, which is hard because he's going on. And you have this other thing, this mind wandering, that's wanting your attention to wander. Now notice how that's like evolution. The wandering is introducing variation, and then the selection is killing most but not all that variation off. And you keep evolving your attentional fittedness. And what you have is, right, PP removes the homunculus from RR. The homunculus in RR is, but where did the opponent processing come from? The RR removes the homunculus in predictive processing. What's setting the precision weighting? Nothing. Just like the combination of Mendelian genetics and Darwinian selection remove the homunculus from the account of how organisms are constantly being redesigned by evolution to fit a changing and multiple environment. That's the proposal. I hope that worked.
No, it does. It makes perfect sense, to be honest, that it's a sensory motor loop that's kind of this dynamic coupling to the environment. So you don't have a homunculus that's just in the head. It's actually this opponent processing system that's working off each other in a kind of autopoietic self-organizing, which I think makes sense. But I guess what I'm trying to pick out of that is where the agency, because I know a lot of your work on meditation, on practices, is really enhancing agency. And something I was hearing in what you were saying is that the perennial problems of self-destruction and self-deception that are lurking in there, in how our agency functions, there are these potentials for us to become, I suppose, self-destructive or self-deceptive, and that is the antithesis of agency in a way. So I'm kind of wondering, so we have this agency, but then how do we increase it or optimize it in that sense?
Yes, and that's the second.
And does meaning come into that as well?
Yeah. Let's talk about that. And that's the second point. But I want to make sure that we're on the same page about the first part. So remember I said to put a pin in this idea that, modeling the world and modeling itself are co-arising together. That's what predictive processing is getting. And then relevance realization is not subjective or objective, but something that binds. Relevance is like adaptivity. The adaptivity isn't in the organism or in the environment. It's how the organism and the environment fit together. Same thing with relevance. It's that binding. But it's this connectedness. It's this mutual co-creation of relevance. And so you've got that binding to the world, and you've got modeling yourself in order to model the world, and modeling the world. And in modeling the world, you increase your modeling of yourself. And then built into this is, create the evolution, the self-organization within recursion of self-correcting processes, where we are doing two kinds of very, very broadly, two kinds of corrections. One is we can alter our actions and the world in order to maintain that fittedness to the world. The other is we can change how we are modeling ourselves, because it could be that the system itself is causing the distortion or the error. And then what you need is, right, these two also start to autopoietically correct each other, right? Because if I'm doing this and it's making more of this go crazy, oh, wait, slow this down, right? If I'm getting rid of potential sources of error here and suddenly I'm losing grip on the world, but if I coordinate these two together, then I start to get this autopoietic agency in which I'm getting this ongoing self-organizing evolution between, right, this modeling process correcting itself and the organism correcting its connection to the world. And agency starts to be born out of that. And then what you have is a system that has the emergent seeking of enhancing the connectedness and removing the self-deception. And I think that's at the core of agency. And so it emerges. And it emerges as something that starts to be a virtual engine on that whole predictive processing, relevance realizing system.
Yeah, it's a very active inference in terms of we can modify our model of the world to fit it better to the sensory data, or we can modify the world to better fit our model of it.
And we have to coordinate those together, because if
we have to do both
at the same time in this, again, in this opponent processing fashion. So we build it, we just keep locking the RR and the PP together, even in order to get this capacity. So think about agency. Agency is the ability to detect the consequences of your action. That's predictive processing, but then modify your behavior, right, in order to alter the consequences. Well, that's relevance realization. And so you loop them together to get the core grammar of agency. And agency is therefore always bound to itself as it's binding to the world, and as it's binding to the world, it's bound to itself. And I would argue that gives us a lot of what we mean when we're talking about agency, and we don't need any homunculus in there to do that.
And where does meaning come into it? I know you said in a recent, I can't remember exactly which interview it was, but something to the fact that meaning is optimal agency. And I'm thinking in a Vygotskian fashion, I'm thinking of Csikszentmihalyi flow states, that it's happening at the edge of our competence. I'm interested. Yeah, where does the meaning come into agency?
Beautiful. That was beautiful. I think so. Meaning is that connectedness. I use the word, and I use the word deliberately for the consonances it has, the connotations it has. It's religio, because religio means that binding. That relevance that anticipatory relevance realization is not cold calculation. It's how we care about some information rather than another, how we commit to various courses of action, how we constitute our agency. This is just intrinsically important and valuable to us. And so that is what is meant by meaning when we're talking about not initially, at least, semantic meaning, but the meaning in life kind of meaning. Because when you get at the guts of what people are talking about, they're talking about a sense of belonging. Their agency in the world fit together like an agent and arena. They're right. They're doing that they matter. They're connected to something that has a reality beyond themselves, but in some sense enhances their agency, so they can love it. Like, if you pay attention to the phenomenological, functional, descriptive language in the psychology of meaning in life and in belonging, it fits very tightly to this model of religio that predictive processing relevance realization gives you. And then you get, well, then if there's a concern that doesn't get messed up, right? And remember, whenever I'm doing this, I'm also doing how the system is modeling itself, remember? So please, right? So I can't really do something like that. Would be my gestures would be weird, right? It always is like, it's always caring about that because it is fundamentally autopoietic. It is taking care of itself because it is constantly making itself. Your mind is constantly making yourself in order to serve how your body is constantly making itself. And so you really care about this information rather than that information because you have real needs. And then your mind, in trying to address the embodied needs, is taking care of itself as I've just explained, it's autopoietic. And so it takes care of those things that it needs in order to continue to make itself. And then that gives you the meaning. And then that meaning is about getting that optimal agency. And let me try and flesh it out, and then I'll shut up. Right. So Plato gives this amazing argument in the Republic, where he says, look, one thing we're trying to do is coordinate all the internal processes that have different, they're anticipating the world at different degrees. This is exactly what predictive processing says, right? Each level is more concrete, more abstract, and we have to get them into correct alignment so they're not at war with each other. And when we do that, we reduce how much that inner conflict can mess up how we're seeing the world. And as we see the world, we can see into it more deeply. And as we see into it more deeply, we get better at modeling ourselves. It allows us to get better at modeling the world. And then he says, we satisfy our two meta desires. What's a meta desire? It's just like meta problem. When we try to satisfy any desire, we want to satisfy two meta desires. That whatever is satisfying our desire is not causing massive inner conflict. We want inner peace. And that what is satisfying our desire is real. And what Plato says is it's possible to get those so they're mutually affording each other, that inner peace and that seeing more deeply in the world. And he calls that anagage. That's the ascent out of the cave. That's optimal agency, optimal connection to the world, optimal meaning, optimal inner peace.
Yes, I'm so glad that you brought up Plato as well, because I've been reading the theory of motivation, some of the literature on theory of motivation within predictive processing, and there's this multi-dimensional drive to goal problem that you see coming up with these different, you have multiple motivations at the same time, you have to satisfy them, you have to organize your behavior in order to do it in short term and long run, and you have to initiate these action patterns. And it reminded me so much of what Plato was saying about the tripartite self. Your work from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, of having these fundamental, because we have with the dialogical model of the self, you have this problem of divided attention from short term, long term, across multiple timescales. And in some sense, that when we harmonize those, what you're experiencing is flow, this optimal subjective experience of that they're in alignment with one another. And it's so, that definition, I suppose, of meaning, which kind of goes through attention to agency to meaning, I think that could be used normatively in order to evaluate persuasive technologies. Like, is it doing that? Or is it messing that up?
Okay, so first of all, that was beautiful. That was really good. I had to hold myself back because I just want to sort of cheer. That was really well said. I want to make one point, and then I'll answer your question about a normativity on persuasion. We have to remember, when I'm talking about anticipation, it's very easy to just talk about it in a temporal sense, right? But it's always temporal, spatial, temporal, right? Spatial, temporal, because it's not only into time, but frequently into space, because you're moving and navigating the world. We can call that horizontal anticipation. And what relevance realization says is, well, you're going to get you're going to get optimal gripping about where you're going to then localize your optimal grip, right? And again, no, it's not, because we have massively recursive, right, self-organization, opponent processing. But what I want you to bring in, and this is something that isn't talked about enough in the predictive processing literature, although they admit it's there, is, well, if the bottom level is like very concrete at, seconds and very close temporal spatial, and the upper level is very, very abstract patterns in your ontology. There's also a vertical anticipation, which isn't anticipation into time and space. It's it's aligning the very, very concrete to the very, very abstract, and you also have to optimally grip there. Where are you? And think about what you're doing is you're situating, right, where the sort of origin point for the orientation of your agency by optimally gripping vertically and horizontally, and finding where they best intersect. And that's sort of where you situate your agency. And you're constantly you and I right now are in a very sort of high abstract space, but I'll drop down when I need to get a drink from my water, right? And then I move into this much faster, and then I got to go back to, okay, a little bit deeper. We're in this conversation, a little bit more abstract. And you see what I mean? Right? So there's a vertical and it's better probably not to call it anticipation. It's the same kind of thing. I call this vertical alignment and horizontal anticipation are going on within the RRPP. And I think that's very, very important to dealing with the question you brought up. I then want to move to your proposal, which I'm in strong agreement with. I think once we get a notion of optimal agency, and then we can talk about things like the optimal conditions environmentally and biologically, and they're always locked together. They're always locked together, right? For the flourishing of optimal agency, and not only individual optimal agency, but our collective optimal agency, when we band together to work in concert to generate the collective intelligence that can solve problems that can only be solved beyond the sensory motor capability of individuals. And we are doing that all the time. We're doing it right now. We're relying on people running the electric grid, making these computers, blah, 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 blah. Right? I think what you can then talk about is, right, do you have devices of persuasion that are self-correcting because they're always trying to track those conditions within and without, and within individuals and within collectives that are optimizing for overall flourishing of optimal agency? Yes. And I think that is the Platonic proposal. That's eudaimonia through and through. We're right, and I think it's Aristotle's proposal too. It's obviously the Neoplatonic proposal. And so what we want to do is we want to and there's part of that that is just a scientific question, which is let's do, and a lot of people are, by the way, let's do the science to figure that out. Let's figure that out. And then let's decide that we find human flourishing individually and collectively, optimal meaning, optimal agency, and they're interlocked. That's what we're just going to regard as the intrinsic good that we're pursuing. And if you say, well, no, I'll say, no, all your moral systems actually presuppose that. And then we can go through a long philosophical argument. But I think we should be able to come to a consensus view. That's what we're all, right, orienting to. And then once that we get the what are the conditions, then we can bring up the prescriptive projects of, well, what are the practices? What are the norms? What are the things we should do when we are evaluating many things, not just persuasive technologies and devices, those for sure, but many things that alter individual and collective anticipation and relevance realization.
And I think it's 100% related to the question of AI and strong AI.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Like that's, I know, I'm sure you've been sick of talking about it at this point.
No,
but
not at all. No.
um, it was something I was thinking about listening to your conversation on Ken's channel with David and Jonathan. And when it was such a brilliant conversation. I mean, it was absolutely amazing.
I love all those guys,
like,
man.
So good. But I thought the difference of opinion, I thought part of it as well was thinking about creating AI as an agent, like a human being, or creating AI as an environment. Because so much of this first generation of AI is an environment. I mean, the large scale curation algorithms of social media are really what's organizing our experience online. And that's, it's not a human being, but it's playing this role of orchestrating a lot of our experience and people's development. And so an optimal environment, creating an optimal AI or an optimal environment would be, I think, in this case of trying to foster optimal agency, optimal meaning, which is really optimal well-being as well. Like, if that was the normative North Star of that environment, you could have something that would be massively beneficial to be. And I see in social media the opposite of that. They've designed it to try and take away people's agency and been very successful at doing a lot of harm with it. But by that same token, it could be used positively, I think. And that for me is the beneficial AI versus just like making a living thing. I don't know if that's landing, but
no, it's more than landing. That's very good. I should have sorry, that would be insulting to you. I don't want to take. So this is not meant as an insult to you. It's meant as a criticism to me. I should have thought of that because I'm on. I like what I mean is people want to reduce AI to being a tool, right? And the
Mhm.
problem with these emerging things is they could become agents in the way we've talked about it here. But I didn't pay attention to exactly the intervening variable you just put your finger brilliantly on. And this is Heidegger's point, right? That technology is not just tools. Technology is also an environment that shapes us fundamentally, even at an ontological level. Sorry, Mohan, I just want to absorb that. That is a brilliant insight. That is really important. And yeah, and in some ways, what was going on there was, right, a negotiation around the relationship between the emerging agency, potentially emerging agencies in these AGIs, and the kind of environment that they may emerge in and then may actually start to impose on us. By the way, is that a fair grasping of your point?
Yeah, I think that's because looking at them as agents that are going to outcompete us or somehow take over and become rulers, or that we trick ourselves with, I think ignores what they're performing, the role they're actively performing now in the ecosystem,
Yeah. Yeah.
where they've
Yeah.
found a niche at the moment.
Yeah, and so let me just see if I can weave the two together because I like what you just did. So if my argument was like they don't have to become agents. We can't make predictions because it's dependent on threshold choices we have to make. We could just continue to make more of what they are, and they don't really have their own relevance realization. They're not making meaning for themselves,
Mm.
right? Because they're deeply parasitic on all on our RPP throughout multiple levels of training, and they're not rational. They're not set up to care about the truth, to care about goodness, so they're not self-corrective. And what we do is we try to tin can in a few things, and it just goes massively awry. We just saw that with Google AI, right? Oh, what we'll do is we'll put in our moral code. Oh, good, yeah, that'll work, right? Okay,
Nice
so
one.
that's not going to work, right? Now we can say what we'll do is we'll just let this keep running, and these things will be wickedly intelligent, but they'll be highly irrational, and that's very problematic. And so we'll face this threshold choice. Do we want to make them genuinely self-corrective, which means we want to make them genuinely caring about the truth, which means we have to make them autopoietic in a certain way. We have to make them sociocultural in a certain way. And I give technical arguments for all of that, and people can just look at the video essay or that conversation. But and my point was, if we do this right, we could make beings who create an environment for us that is conducive to us becoming enlightened. And that would be optimal, right? We could make, and that's what I mean by silicon sages. If we make them genuinely care about what is most true, what is most good, and what is most beautiful, they will start to create an environment that could conduce us towards enlightenment. Or we could then discover that they're not capable of enlightenment and we alone are, and that would be a just terrific ontological discovery about us. And then I argued, and this goes with your argument as well, in order to do that, we have to start changing our environment. Because up until now, we have been able to rely on our naturally given general intelligence to act as a template against which we compare these machines. But if we want to make judgments not about just intelligence, but rationality, let alone wisdom, we need a lot more human models, individually and collectively, about what is rational and what is wise. And so we have to elevate the environment in which these machines can emerge. And that's what we mean by mentoring the machines. We create the environment, this is a moral imperative on us, that we have to create a lot more rationality in the Platonic sense, not in the logical sense. Right, a lot more reasonableness. Let's put it that way. We have to create a lot more reasonable self-correction, properly, adopting the right perspective, properly proportioning things, all that sort of stuff. We have to, and then bootstrap that up even into people that we consider wise. We have to have a lot more of that to get the environment that will give birth to these machines right, along with the technical innovations, so that they can become silicon sages that then alter our environment so we can do towards enlightenment. And for me, that is my proposed solution to the alignment problem. But you gave me a missing piece of the argument. You just did it right here. And thank you.
Well, it's not me coming up with it on my own anyway, but because there's a suggestion that Miller, Mark Miller, who you work with, and Ben White, who's at the
Yeah.
University of Sussex, and their work, because they're talking about ambient smart environments.
Yes.
Their argument was that because the AI will have all of your data, it could be essentially an extension of metacognition, the same way
Yeah.
that we use like self-tracking technologies for, it has your health data that you couldn't possibly, consider doing on your own. And they can be used like a way of bootstrapping our
Yep.
inherit, which I suppose would help with the self-correction, with the rationality. And
That's
so,
great.
yeah, that would be, I'm thinking about it because social media reform, one of the big problems with social media, obviously, is the content curation algorithms are curating the public conversation in a way, and they're optimized for engagement, they're optimized for drama, moral,
Uh,
emotional
yeah.
conflict. But if that was optimized for something like agency, meaning, what would that look like? I don't know, because we're feeding the data, we're creating the content, but there's too much content for any one person to see, much
Yep.
like the certain relevance problem that we
Yeah.
encounter
Yeah.
in reality. But that problem is being encountered digitally now because there's so much on the internet. So the AI is being used to solve that relevance problem digitally,
Yes.
but is doing a very bad job of it. So I'm kind of thinking, could we use how we actually do relevance realization to rebuild that in a better way?
Right. So, and first of all, the project is the right project, but it is a wicked problem. It's both a ill-defined problem and a problem that keeps
Yep.
throwing us into dilemma. Because, well, what do we do now? Well, we're using the AI to do the relevance realization. Well, what's it doing? Well, it's actually being governed by the autopoiesis of the market, and that's actually determining what is going to be shaping the environment to parasitize, right? Basically, our biological salience machinery and relevance realization machinery. And we say, well, that's bad. And that's what's going on here. We basically have created, and I'm using this word now in the technical sense that Frankfurt means. We're creating massive bullshit in which we sever salience from importance or truth or goodness. And what we're doing is just creating really, it's like candy, right? We're creating super salient stuff that is not linked to the rational project of caring about the true, the good, and the beautiful. So that's bullshit on a suit like the scale of a massive global tsunami, right? And so we say, oh, that's bad. We've got to remove that from the market. And this is because we have a dearth. We have an absolute famine of wisdom institutions and wisdom ecologies of practices and communities. We say, oh, well, who, where? The state? Do we want to give this to the government? Oh no, that's a really bad idea. And so now and so because of the meaning crisis and because we are so starved for, respectable institutions and traditions and lineages of the cultivation of wisdom, we don't have anything to point to that we can say, yeah, let's use them as the people in right running this, or at least supervising it. And so we're forced to, oh, I don't want the market. Let's give some power to the state. Oh no, this is going really badly. Let's give it back to the market. Oh no, that's going back. And we're just toing and froing because we're caught in this wicked problem of we need exactly the kind of reform you're talking about. And that's the market's not going to do it. The market's not going to do it. That's like the way, like trying to get the oil industry to admit that lead in gasoline was toxic. You can't rely on the market to do that. You have to do this external intervention, right? But the problem is, as soon as you start to do that, you empower the state in ways that become horribly noxious and potentially toxic.
And that's part of the problem, I think, as well, is that there's no essence to relevance. Like,
Oh,
there's no,
yeah.
like what you'd said, like there's no essential, like if once you have a top down system of relevance,
Oh, you're
you have
doomed.
a tyranny.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's
yeah.
so we can't solve it that way, because as soon as it says no, this is the thing top down, it's going to become even. I mean, that's kind of the problem right now. So again, I'm thinking the enhancement of relevance realization has to be part of it. Like it has to help people to become more fitted to their, because right now we're trying to adapt to the environment's trying to adapt to us to keep us
Yeah,
using it longer,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
have this kind of reciprocal narrowing thing going on, which is why it's addictive. But do you think if it was ran the other way to enhance people's relevance realization rather than a top down relevance, we could have more reciprocal opening? Like you'd
First of
have
all,
a
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
yeah,
You
no,
froze.
that's literally, that's my proposal anyway, is that that could, break the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah. So yeah. So first of all, excellent. The point exactly. This is why I'm very much metapolitical. One of many arguments. Any top-down strategy is trying to find the essence of relevance, and I have argued, and you cite me very accurately here. There cannot be an essence to relevance any more than there can be an essence to adaptivity, right?
Mhm.
Because it's not. It's right. Like take the very strong analogy between relevance realization and evolution. Is there something that's the final form of life? That makes no sense. You don't understand evolution. There is no final form. That's not how it works, right? There is no final form. There is no essential. There is no always relevant. And so
Mhm.
the top down can't happen. So we have this weird thing. We have the market that's self-correcting, but it's not self-correcting in our best interest. There's at least the potential for the government to act in our best self-interest, but it turns into a tyranny because it has to act as if there's an essence to relevance. And this is, again, the wicked problem. The idea that we could bottom up this is, of course, uh, I think, sorry, I don't want to take away from you, but that's my proposal about
Mhm.
stealing the culture. We have to create
Mhm.
viable subcultures in which the economy of right relationship to what is true, good, and beautiful, and meaning take priority over pleasure and comfort. Not that people should not have no pleasure or comfort in their lives, but you shouldn't eat mostly candy. You should only once in a while eat some candy, right? Same thing, right? And what we need to do is build what you just said, that environment bottom up. Now, people, as soon as they hear that, they say that's pie in the sky, that's airy fairy. Well, actually, no. I mean, what happened in right the Roman Empire is you had Christianity building all of these little home churches offering this new way of agape, and it eventually bottom up to change the environment, and then the government changed, and then the market changed, etc. I'm not advocating for Christianity. I'm pointing to a historical example. To make that clear, I'll point to a second example. You have the Nordic countries, very authoritarian, very agrarian. They start the Bildung movement of all this network of secular monasteries, and they turn the Nordic countries into the very successful democracies of today. So what we are talking about here is not pie in the sky. We have historical precedents that says it is possible, it is doable if we make it happen. Now, the problem I've been trying to wrestle with is you need something almost like a religion, or at least a religious philosophy, right, to drive this kind of massive change of the environment, bottom up. And that comes with all kinds of problems. And I don't even talk about the religion that's not a religion anymore, because, first of all, the word religion is too triggering for people. And secondly, it sounds to people like I'm trying to set up a religion, and I am not. I'm going to keep saying that. I am not. I'm trying to
Mhm.
figure out what's happening in the world in which there's something like an advent of what we consider sacred. Bottom up. What's happening bottom up in a new sense of what sacredness is? And can I offer myself as somebody who is trying to pilgrimage that, and so it becomes clearer to others, just basically a magnifying lens on what's happening and what's possible, so that bottom up thing can happen. That's now the project I'm most invested in, and that's what's going to be the core of my next big series, Walking the Philosophical Silk Road. That's what it's about.
And I think what we've been talking about this entire conversation as well is part of that new sacred. That's what I've been
Yes.
thinking of,
Yeah.
a book basically that I'm going to call Bury the Sacred Bones, because I think we're in a kind of situation of like, there's a TV trope where like a greedy land developer digs up an Indian burial ground and puts a load of condos on it, and then the condos are haunted and weird things start happening and there's ghosts and there's ghouls and
Oh,
stuff. And I think with social media, really what they've done is they've dug up those ancient
yeah.
evolved uh, subsystems that we use to make sense of the world and monetize them, and you see it happening in so many ways. But if we could agree that there's something within us that's sacred, that agency that needs to be protected, that could be the cornerstone on which you could change policy and you could change other things if people will come to an agreement. And I think
Yeah.
in even in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, regulating social media now in the EU, they've put something higher than the company's bottom line. They call it consumer dignity, human autonomy, but there isn't a really rigorous kind of account of what that
Yeah.
is. And,
Yeah.
you know, there's all these problems around free will. There's questions within a scientific paradigm of, up until now, I suppose, in dynamical systems, there hasn't really been an account of that particular human ability or freedom or
Mhm.
whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think for me anyway, that could be a place whereby we could rally around that. And
I think that's right.
both sides need it. It's a universal part of being a human being.
I agree with that. I see that as part of a bigger thing, which is a
Mm.
recovery not only of the potential for religio and wisdom within the social environment, but also part of the larger project of realizing that it's not only the sacred in us. In fact, I would say it's the sacred between us and the world, because that's where
Yes.
religio
Okay.
is, right? And that means we also have to, we have to reconfigure our relationship to the world. In weird ways, uh, obviously there's causal and socioeconomic interaction, but there's also something deeper about shared problematic structures. Dealing with the environmental crisis and dealing with the social media environment have some important parallel problems and principles, and people need to be exploring that. And I think part of what the advent of the sacred is trying to do is to try to get that coordinated in some way, so we recover
Yep.
the possibility of the sacred being something very salient to us, as opposed to something that is either retreated into the ridiculous and the dismissed, or retreats into sort of horror, or nihilism, or something like that.
Because I think it's exactly as well what you were talking about with David and Jonathan and Ken in that conversation, which is that in just the material vision of success that drives market economy can't answer those existential spiritual questions. But
No.
in some of the AI stuff, it's almost like they're using that to try and address those questions. I saw Tristan Harris on Joe Rogan's podcast quoted a study on people creating AI that they're mostly determinist. They mostly also want to speak to a hyper intelligent being and want to be involved in creating that hyper intelligent being. So I almost think we're playing out a bit of a Sorcerer's Apprentice thing with a
Yeah.
lot of the AI stuff, which is that we're trying to build something that will give us existential spiritual answers. And we're in a, but the problem is we need those answers to build something that's not a
Yeah.
monster.
Yeah.
Like,
So let's do the mythology though. Give up the sorcerer model. Take up the sage model, right? And that was a different way, right? You didn't have sorcery. You had theurgia, which was the attempt to properly make oneself receptive to the gods, and so that one could better orient towards the divine, rather than what I'll do is I'll make and manipulate these divine forces. I think that I wow, I knew this was going to be good, and this is really really flying as a conversation. But yeah, I think part of stealing the culture is to get people to, and especially the people within the AI industry, drop the sorcerer myth. drop it, disidentify with it, take up the sage mythology, take that up. That is the way we can do what you want, but in a way that isn't going to set us on a path to destruction.
And I think you made a really good point in that conversation as well, which is that potentially, even if the bad business model stuff happens with AI and it does go the tragic way, I mean, social media is an example of how that's already happened. But I think that creates then the conversation of how can we do this better? You know, just because the billionaires build it the first time and it goes wrong and it's really damaging doesn't mean that it's going to be always that way. I mean, this could potentially be part of something that's actually a very important part of human development, in terms of we're still, you know, the internet's whatever 30, 40 years old, if even. So yeah, I don't know, it's not, for me it's not a finished story, but
Oh yeah.
it's definitely the big battle of this time, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't make predictions other than the meta prediction that almost all of the predictions were going to turn out to be false, which they have. The predictions that within 18 months and blah, blah, and all that sort of stuff. Univariate measures of complex causal networks on a nonlinear graph. Human beings are really, really crap at that. Really, really crap at that. So I just like, no. Instead, what I tried to do is, and I've been proposing, is we're going to face choice points. That's why I call them thresholds rather than predictions. Do we want to make it rational? Do we want to make it really care about the true and the good and the beautiful so it can be massively self-correcting? Oh boy, but if we do that, we start to give it agency and then blah, blah, blah. Like we're going to face a lot of choice points. And to your point, those choice points will be continually places where we could exercise a lot of wisdom and foresight and concern for our collective well-being and avoiding the tragedy of the commons. And so we do have many places in which we could steer the ship towards, you know, the Silicon sages that are working with us towards mutual enlightenment or something like that, rather than, you know, Mrs. Davies or other dystopian possibilities.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that. That is at least a somewhat hopeful ending, and a brilliant conversation. I really thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
This was a great. I've been. This is, you know, I enjoy our conversations. Please, if you want me to come back at another time, I'd be happy to do so.